For as long as humans have been telling stories, the fantasy genre has existed, weaving together epic tales of magic, monsters, and feats of human strength, the likes of which our world has never experienced. From ancient mythological epics of pagan gods to whatever that Will Smith buddy cop movie with the orc was supposed to be, it's not unfair to say that we've seen the entire spectrum of what the fantasy genre has to offer. And in nerd culture especially, where fantasy and sci-fi have always dominated the creative space, new works really have to step it up to stand out from the rest. Enter Frieren, a story that at its core wouldn't seem to do that at all. With the synopsis giving more slice-of-life vibes than actual fantastical storytelling, you'd assume a series like this could be overlooked by non-anime fans. After all, the immortal suffering trope isn't unique to this story, and Frieren's world is, at least on a surface level, the standard sort of Tolkien-inspired setting you could find in any fantasy story without even trying. I would even go so far as to say that, for those just looking to enjoy a show without thinking too much, Frieren is perfect, as it has enough broad appeal as a basic fantasy adventure while still providing deeper themes for those who want something a bit more thought-provoking. This duality of broad appeal and intellectual stimulation doesn't stop at the storytelling and world-building either, as the art, animation, and most importantly for this video, music, all cover these aspects just as well, making it no secret as to why Frieren not only surpassed Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood as the #1 anime of all time on my anime list, but also confirmed that the show's composer is someone that went unrecognized for far too long. Evan Call is someone I've wanted to talk about since the start of my channel, mainly because of how much I fell in love with Violet Evergarden's phenomenal soundtrack, though not forgetting other incredible works that he would later write like Jose the Tiger and the Fish and My Happy Marriage, as well as some of his earlier works like Big Order and Schwarzesmarken. I actually had an argument with someone that said that his music for Violet Evergarden was just basic classical orchestra music without any substance, and it honestly broke my brain trying to rationalize that. Not connecting with the type of music that others do, or vice versa, is something I'm all too familiar with, but to claim that Call's music lacks any sort of musical depth is both wrong and laughable. In fact, it doesn't take much searching to see the general response that Frieren's soundtrack has had on its audience, and by fully leaning into these classical techniques and sounds, Call's music for Frieren has elevated it to the top of modern fantasy stories. So with compositional subversions in Dungeon Meshi and sonic rewiring in Spice and Wolf, let's take a look at the third and final pillar of fantasy music in modern anime and how the music of Frieren capitalizes on our understanding of fantasy to fully flesh out the world beyond Journey's End. For the most part, Frieren's soundtrack consists of three main types of music that follow the way the story is told: narrative tracks related to the stories and characters, montage tracks, and battle tracks. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but generally you can find most of the tracks under at least one of these categories, and I'd argue you could probably tell which pieces are which without having seen the show or reading the track titles. As an example, let's delve into the track playing currently. As you can probably guess, Journey of a Lifetime is a narrative track, serving as both the main theme of the series and somewhat of an overture. Evan Call is known particularly well for his lush emotional orchestrations, so it comes as no surprise that Frieren's main theme would be written for orchestra. But taking a deeper listen, the music fully embraces and leans into the fantasy vibes portrayed by the story, utilizing not only the standard Western orchestra, but a huge number of traditional folk instruments from across Europe for a truly medieval atmosphere. To be perfectly honest, I'm not familiar enough with most of these folk instruments to determine which ones are playing when, so I can only go so far as to group them under their respective instrument categories when talking about their placement in the arrangements. While these instruments aren't used in every track across the soundtrack, their presence and the frequency with which they do appear throughout is crucial to understanding how deeply the world of Frieren goes, truly placing us in the perceived time period we associate such high fantasy stories with. To begin, the piece opens with a string soloist, most likely violin, though possibly a rebec or vielle given the fiddle-like style of playing. A choir and drums support from beneath to add some phrasing and harmony as we're introduced to the main leitmotif that the rest of the soundtrack is based on. The melody has us start on the tonic of D, moving in a simple rising and falling motion with one small jump up to A at the end, A being the dominant tone that most wants to resolve back to our tonic of D. Alongside this, the choral harmony mostly sticks to D, but also jumps up to the F sharp to make the first half of this melody conclude with less stability. As this is the exact midpoint, we can interpret this rising motion into an unstable F sharp minor 7 chord as Himmel's party reaching the Demon King's castle after their long journey. The following pattern has the melody coming down from a high D to land on E, where in this instance the phrase resolves back to D. It's important to recognize that the harmonies here begin to move around more than in the first half, progressing through B minor, E major 9, A major 7, D, showing how the world was saved and peace restored in the wake of the Demon King's defeat. While the overture does have the harmonies resolved to the tonic in a conclusive manner, this melody typically ends on a more open-ended chord, as we'll hear later. This is implied by the string solo's line finishing and holding this E, and this openness represents the lack of a true end of the journey, fittingly for the story of Frieren being the continuation of her life many years after what would normally be considered the end of the main story. The big orchestral blast following this melody represents the start of the story we will now experience, shaped around it in a more texturally rich rendition to bring the past to life in the present. The main melody is mostly carried by the strings, with the woodwinds supporting and the brass providing harmony and counter melody. From an orchestration point of view, this is a simple way to ease the listener into the richer section, as we are simply expanding upon what was already heard as a string melody. The melody is also expanded upon by the brass and solo singer, taking what was a fairly simple leitmotif and sending it soaring up to heights befitting of such an expansive fantasy world. Following a fun two-part jig carried out by some of the folk instruments, we're suddenly hit with a much more solemn section. Here the percussive elements cut out, leaving us with only a tenor recorder and the choir. Where the previous orchestral sections had us experiencing the scale and grandeur of this magical world, this new section represents the feelings of the characters as they relate and reminisce of times before this story began. While Frieren's new journey is much more leisurely than her previous, it often has her recalling moments from her past, bringing about realizations that she sometimes finds solace in but also occasionally experiences less positive feelings over. This melancholic section is expanded on as the strings come in, changing the harmonies for a darker starting chord of B minor that quickly progresses up to a much brighter and more open A major. We then circle back to the main motif once again, this time led by the horns. However, the key shifts from D major to F major, suddenly rising a minor third to give a higher, more hopeful sense to the piece. Aside from filling out the entire orchestra and choir for the grandest sound we've yet experienced of the piece, there isn't much to point out about this section until the very end, once all the instruments have dropped out to leave us with a simple harp solo. Where the strings from before ended the main melody on E for an open-ended major 9th sound, this harp closes the piece out by repeating the first half of the motif, cutting out halfway to leave us hanging on C, the perfect 5th. While this still leaves the piece feeling unresolved to match Frieren's ongoing story, the harp solo leaves us in a calm state. Like the tale of heroism is more of a bedtime story that we, the listeners, will simply have to wait until tomorrow night for the continuation of, framing the story as one that, while intense and dramatic at times, is more about the everyday experiences of an elf and her traveling companions. Here we have one of the more prominently featured montage tracks in the soundtrack. While it usually plays over scenes that introduce the year and location that Frieren and her companions find themselves in, what it represents is more abstract, as evidenced by the title. Many of these montage tracks are written in a way that has smaller ensembles interplaying with the larger orchestral ones, creating a sort of ebb and flow and intensity to help the audience feel the passage of time and changes that occur over the months and years that go by throughout the show. Taking Time Flows Ever Onwards as our example, we need look no further than the soloistic instruments set against the full orchestra, a quartet of tin whistle, lute, tenor recorder, and fiddle. Again, these medieval instruments play a huge role in our perception of this fantasy world, clearly marking the relative time period that we can envision these kinds of characters and societies existing within. This is also expanded upon by playing in A Dorian, the Dorian mode being the most common amongst Western folk music and the one most indicative of medieval European-esque settings. We start with the lute strumming A minor and E, setting a relatively simple pace and tonality before walking about A minor, D, F, G, and back to A minor. The simple quarter beat rhythms have the track plodding along like simple footsteps, giving the more standout line to the high tin whistle. Importantly for a montage track such as this is for the instrument or instruments leading the piece not to have a particularly strong melody. While the melody here is certainly singable and easy enough to memorize, it also doesn't carry any particular emotions behind it, simply walking down an octave, back up to the high A, and down the octave from there, ending without any difficult rhythms. This helps the soundtrack to blend into the images on screen and also allows a montage of different scenes to flow together, even if what's being depicted doesn't necessarily have a consistent mood from cut to cut. This duet ends with a short interlude played by the full orchestra, with the strings building in a melody while giving way to the brass right as the phrase completes. The specifics of what is being played by this big orchestral section are, interestingly enough, not that important, as the most important effect is achieved by the simple D major chord held at the end, creating a vastly open sound without resolution, D being the fourth of A Dorian, and thus the most unresolved major triad in the current key. As you can imagine, this open-ended chord evokes a sense of continuation, one that matches with Frieren's journey and pulls us along with it. The opening motif is then repeated with the melody being led by a solo fiddle. This more or less fulfills the same role as before, though the instrument change follows the changes that accompany the group of traveling adventurers. As their goal remains the same, the basic nature of their adventure stays the same as heard in the melody, while the new lead instrument reflects other changes such as the members in the party or their outlook or new traveling environment. Where we see a bigger change is at the transition to the low recorder soloist. The first noticeable change is the melodic shape, this one being much more static and linear than the stair-like zigzagging we get from the tin whistle and fiddle. Mixed with the block chord harmonies from the strings and lute, the timbre of this low recorder also gives the section a more dramatic and heavy feeling, though not in the same way as the full orchestra from before. Again, this sonic expansion doesn't actually indicate anything specific aside from the vastness of Frieren's world and the myriad of emotions that come with traveling about it. This can be felt by the swell and intensity as the strings join in to double the recorder's melody before dropping out for a unison duet on recorder and fiddle. The ebb and flow of the piece without an overly strong melody breathes life into the world without the need to explore the storytelling aspects of it, and in doing so gives a sense of cohesion and realism, as if the music is as natural as the actual sounds of nature it represents. And the most beautiful aspect of all of this is that we can hear it in all of Frieren's montage tracks, from fairly innocuous pieces like Grassy Turtles and Seed Rats, to more dramatic adventure-focused ones like Across the Northern Lands. And of course, we're rounding things out with a battle track, the type of music that likely needs the least amount of explanation to understand. While I'm sure everyone that clicked onto the video came for the breakdown and transcription of Zoltrak, this is where I disappoint by telling you that the most important battle track in the series is actually the one currently playing. Yes, while Zoltrak has gone on to become what is arguably Frieren's most famous piece of music, every battle track throughout the series is actually based off of Evolution of Magic, and for a fairly straightforward reason, that all the battles are based around magic, including Dinkin's fistfight. Compared to most of the later battle tracks, Evolution of Magic has a much more narrative approach, beginning with an unassuming atmosphere led by a synth, hammer, dulcimer, and soft drumming. Throughout this whole opening section, a handful of other instruments like the harp and anvil make appearances, but for the most part what's being played is fairly unimportant, as the focus is on creating a tense atmosphere. If we look at the scene this plays over, it makes a lot of sense, as this is when Frieren and Fern are facing off against Qual, the mage that invented Zoltrak. During this calm section of music, Frieren is explaining to Fern and Qual that, after keeping him sealed for the last 80 years, humanity studied Zoltrak to the point that they not only created spells to defend against it, but that this once unstoppable spell had been reduced to the most basic combat magic in a mage's arsenal. As the explanation comes to a close, Qual decides to see for himself whether humanity has progressed progressed in such a relatively short time span, allowing an ominous choir and strings to swell in as the battle commences. This leads into a rapid dulcimer rhythm to establish the heightened pace and intensity of battle, accompanied by percussive claps to keep the fantastical folk sound alive here as well. The leading instrument shifts to the tin whistle as the dulcimer takes on a more supporting role, now doubled by the harp and supported by drums. For the most part, the opening of the battle still feels light despite the more intense rhythms, and this also falls in line with the mentality of the battle as we are viewing it through the lens of Frieren and Frieren. The frantic pace of the music aligns with this being Frierin's first real taste of combat, as well as her first encounter with a demon of this caliber, while the relatively light and flighty sound represents the ease with which they are able to fend off Qual's attacks. Just as Frieren said, Qual was once so powerful that defeating him was all but impossible, but through humanity's innovation as a result of their short lifespans, magic evolved to the point where this once indomitable force was now no better than a modern novice. The strings come in to expand the scale of battle, zigzagging in an upwards motion before swelling to a full orchestral blast. We can interpret this rise in intensity as Qual coming to the realization that his magical abilities are outdated, changing the way in which he utilizes Zoltrak but being unable to cast anything more powerful. This is a shift in the tide of battle, with the tin whistle coming back to the forefront above the orchestral elements to show that despite his more wild manner of attacking, Frieren and Frieren can still handle him with ease, defending against every shot of magic sent their way. The battle comes to a close with a unison series of strikes on the tin whistle, dulcimer, strings, and percussion, marking the moment when Frieren uses Zoltrak against Qual at a level he could never hope to achieve in his current form. As his body disintegrates upon his defeat, the piece closes out with some simple string chords, E flat, A minor, and C, before closing out on one final G chord to finish on the tonic and cap off the piece with a nice solid conclusion. As I mentioned, battle tracks are fairly straightforward, but it's through analyzing evolution of magic that we can see how it affects future battle tracks throughout the series. Most apparent is of course Zoltrak, with its shared dulcimer rhythm and early tin whistle melody. Some less obvious parallels come from the subdued choir and evolution of magic becoming much more prominent vocal melodies in Zoltrak. In other tracks like Dragon Smasher and Knife to the Throat, the strong usage of folk instruments keeps us tied to the setting and adventure narrative, while the more dramatic orchestral battle tracks like Demon's Bane focus in on the much more life-threatening circumstances unique to those pivotal moments. No matter how much each piece differs, there's a sense of connection that each battle track has to evolution of magic, whether it's purely stylistic, instrumentation-based, or features material references within the parts. And beyond even just connecting the battle tracks, these same connections can be seen and heard all throughout the soundtrack to keep the entire world of Frieren feeling consistent and vast, immersing its viewers and listeners within the story as if we were a part of the world as well. No matter how much someone like myself talks about it and breaks down my own interpretations, to hear the work that was put in to make this world so vibrant and beautiful through music just by watching and listening alone takes a special kind of composer for a special kind of show. Regardless of how you may feel about Frieren as an anime, Evan Call's work as a composer, or even the fantasy genre in general, it's impossible to overlook the incredible impact that it has had, and for its artistry to have reached so far beyond the usual anime circles and have touched so many in such profound ways, I have no issue with saying that the music for this series may well just be the most important soundtrack to have ever graced the medium of anime. And with that, we've wrapped up the 3 pillars of fantasy music in modern anime, closing out on one that honestly just goes way above and beyond anything that we could or should have expected. While carefully considered subversions and creative reimaginings can work wonders within the genre, honing in on what makes fantasy music recognizable as fantasy music is still unmatched when it comes to composing within the genre. Of course, in the eyes of Crunchyroll, that means nothing when a poorly defined rule set leads to the mediocre first season of Solo Leveling beating out Frieren and every other show that it beat out in basically every category for no reason because their awards are stupid. But I mean, that's just life, I guess. Anyway, for those of you who waited a long time for this video to come out, apologies there, but I also really wanted to make sure that I could fully talk about everything that I wanted to, and Evan Call's super lush orchestrations certainly made transcribing this just a huge struggle. In the end, I don't even know if I was actually able to say everything that I wanted to, but I'm sure that when season 2 eventually rolls around, I'll have another chance to address anything that I might have missed in this video. And actually, that kind of goes for all 3 of the shows that I talked about in this fantasy series, so if you want me to talk about anything else that you think I might have missed in any of those shows, make sure to comment down below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to support the channel and get access to any of the transcriptions I've done for any of my analytical videos, make sure to go over to Patreon and support me over there. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.